Hello, friends. I can see 80% of my viewers don't subscribe while watching videos. Please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and press the bell icon for notifications. Tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I love hearing from all of you. Now let's dive into Story 1. The radio crackled to life at 2:47 a.m. on a bitter February night in New York City. Officer Jake Morrison had been patrolling the Upper West Side for 6 hours. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, and the streets were eerily quiet for Manhattan. His partner, Detective Amy Chun, was filling out paperwork when the dispatcher's voice cut through the silence. Unit 247. We have a disturbance call. Location is the old subway entrance on 91st and Broadway. Caller reports screaming coming from below ground. Sounds like someone in distress. Jake exchanged glances with Amy. That entrance had been sealed for over 15 years, part of an abandoned tunnel system that the city had closed after partial collapse. The metal gates were rusted shut, covered in decades of graffiti and warning signs. Copy that dispatch. Unit 247 responding. Amy replied into the radio. As they drove toward the location, Jake felt an uncomfortable chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. The abandoned subway entrance was in a section of the city that most people avoided after dark. Street lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across empty sidewalks. They pulled up to find the entrance exactly as Jake remembered it, except for one terrifying detail. The heavy metal gate that had been welded shut for years was now standing wide open. The darkness beyond seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. That gate was sealed tight last week, Amy whispered, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. I drove past here just 5 days ago. Jake called it in. Dispatch, the entrance is open. Gate appears to have been cut or forced. Requesting backup. Negative Unit 247. All units are responding to a major incident in Brooklyn. You'll have to investigate alone. Exercise extreme caution. Amy stepped closer to the entrance, listening carefully. From deep below, echoing up through the tunnels, came the faint sound of what might have been sobbing. Or maybe something else entirely. Someone's definitely down there, she said, but her voice carried doubt. The sound was wrong somehow, too rhythmic, too hollow. Jake pulled out a service weapon, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against whatever might be lurking in those tunnels. NYPD, he called down into the darkness. If someone's down there, identify yourself. The sobbing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums, made you want to fill it with noise, any noise. We have to go down, Amy said, though every instinct was telling her to walk away. The iron steps leading down were slick with moisture and decades of decay. Their flashlights revealed graffiti on the walls that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. Some of the symbols weren't like any gang tags Jake had ever seen. They looked almost ritualistic. 20 steps down, 30, 40. The air grew thicker, carrying the smell of rust and something else, something organic and unpleasant. How deep does this go? Amy whispered. Jake was about to answer when they heard it again. Not sobbing this time, but laughter. Low echoing, coming from somewhere ahead in the tunnel system. But it was wrong. The pitch would rise and fall in ways the human vocal cords couldn't manage. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves in what had once been a subway platform. Ancient tiles were cracked and missing, exposing the concrete beneath. Water dripped constantly from somewhere above, each drop echoing like a countdown. There, Amy pointed her flashlight toward the far end of the platform. In the tunnel entrance, barely visible in the darkness, something was moving. Jake squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It looked like a person, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, joints bending in directions that shouldn't be possible. NYPD, stop and identify yourself. Jake shouted, his voice cracking slightly. The thing stopped moving. Then it began to turn around. Amy grabbed Jake's arm. We need to leave. Now. But Jake was transfixed by what he was seeing. As the thing turned, the flashlight beam caught glimpses of what might have been a face. Except the eyes were in the wrong places, and there were too many of them. and they reflected the light like an animal's. Jake! Jake! Amy was pulling him backward toward the stairs. The thing started walking toward them, but its gait was all wrong. It moved like a puppet with half its strings cut, limbs jerking and swaying with each step. That's when they heard the voices. Not one voice, but dozens. All coming from the same throat. Men's voices, women's voices, children's voices, all speaking at once, overlapping, saying different things. Help me. Don't leave. It hurts. Join us. Can't escape. Jake finally broke from his trance and ran. Both officers sprinted up the iron steps, taking them 3 at a time, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they climbed. Behind them, the voices grew louder, more desperate. But worse than the voices was the sound of footsteps following them. Not human footsteps, but something that scraped and clinked against the metal stairs, like claws or bone. They burst out of the entrance into the street, gasping in the cold February air. Jake immediately radioed for backup, for the bomb squad, for anyone who would listen. Amy was already at their patrol car, pulling out flares and emergency tape to seal off the area. What do we tell them? She asked, her hands shaking as she lit the first flare. Before Jake could answer, they heard the metal gate slam shut behind them. When backup finally arrived 20 minutes later, they found the gate welded solid again, as if it had never been opened. The metal showed no signs of recent cutting or forcing. The surveillance camera across the street had malfunctioned at 2:30 a.m., showing only static until 4:15 a.m. Jake and Amy filed their report, but they left out most of what they'd seen. Who would believe them? Instead, they reported investigating suspicious sounds, finding nothing, and recommending the entrance be reinforced. 3 days later, Jake was reviewing incident reports when he found something that made his blood run cold. Over the past 15 years, 17 people had gone missing within a 6-block radius of that subway entrance. All at night, all without a trace. The missing persons files contained photos, and as Jake stared at them, he began to recognize some of the voices they'd heard in the tunnel. Amy found him at his desk, staring at the photographs. "We can't tell anyone," she said quietly. Jake nodded, but he couldn't stop thinking about what they'd seen down there, about the thing that had been calling for help, and the voices of people who'd been missing for years. That night, and every night since, Jake drives past the old subway entrance on his patrol route. The gate remains sealed, covered in rust and graffiti. But sometimes, if he listens carefully, he can hear faint sounds coming from below. Sobbing, laughter, voices calling for help. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 weeks after their encounter, Amy started having the dreams. Every night, she would find herself standing at the entrance to that tunnel. In her dreams, she could hear the voices more clearly. They weren't just calling for help, they were calling her name. Specifically her name. Amy. Amy Chin, come back to us. She would wake up in a cold sweat, but the voices would linger for minutes after she opened her eyes. Her apartment would feel too warm, too close, as if something was watching her from the shadows. Jake noticed the change in his partner immediately. Amy had always been sharp, focused, but now she seemed distracted. She would stare off into space during briefings, jump at sudden sounds, and she developed a nervous habit of touching the small cross she wore around her neck. "You okay, Chin?" he asked one evening as they sat in their patrol car. "I keep thinking about what we saw down there," she admitted. "About those missing people. What if they're not really missing? What if they're still down there, but they're not human anymore?" Jake wanted to tell her she was overthinking it, but he'd been having his own problems. 3 times in the past week, he'd driven past the subway entrance and sworn he saw movement behind the metal bars, shapes pressing against the gate from the inside, trying to get out. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in March. Amy was working a late shift alone. Jake had called in sick with what he claimed was food poisoning. She was patrolling the Upper West Side when she found herself driving toward 91st and Broadway, almost as if the car was steering itself. She parked across the street from the entrance and sat there for 20 minutes, just watching. The street was empty, most of the buildings dark, but there was something different about the subway entrance tonight. The shadows seemed deeper around it, and the air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. That's when she saw the girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a dirty yellow dress that looked like it was from decades ago. The child was standing right in front of the sealed gate, reaching through the bars, as if she was trying to unlock it from the outside. Amy got out of her patrol car and approached slowly. "Hey, sweetie, what are you doing out here so late?" The girl turned around, and Amy's blood went cold. Half of the child's face was normal, pretty even, with bright blue eyes and blonde hair. But the other half was rotted. The skin was gray and peeling. The eye was milky white, and Amy could see part of the skull beneath. "Officer Chin," the girl said in a voice that was far too adult, far too knowing. "We've been waiting for you." Amy reached for a radio, but her hands wouldn't obey her commands. She found herself walking closer to the entrance, closer to the thing that looked like a little girl. "The gate is weakening," the girl continued, pressing her rotted face between the bars. "Soon we'll be able to come out. All of us. We just need someone to help us from this side." Amy was now close enough to see inside the tunnel entrance. The darkness beyond the gate wasn't empty. There were shapes moving in there, dozens of them, all pressing against the barriers, all waiting. "We have such wonderful things to show you," the girl whispered. "Down in the deep tunnels, where the old trains used to run, where people used to disappear even before the city sealed us in." That's when Amy realized the truth. The tunnel hadn't been abandoned because of a collapse. It had been sealed because of what was living down there. Would have been living down there for far longer than 15 years. With tremendous effort, Amy managed to step backward. Stay away from me." The girl smiled, and when she did, Amy could see that her teeth were all wrong. Too sharp, too many of them, arranged in rows like a shark's mouth. "You can't run forever. Amy Chun, we know where you live. We know where you work. We know where you sleep." Amy managed to get back to her patrol car and drive away, but she could feel eyes watching her from every shadow, every dark alley, every basement window. The next morning, she handed in her resignation. Jake tried to talk her out of it, but Amy was already packing her apartment. "I'm moving to California," she told him, "as far from here as I can get." "Amy, you can't let this thing, whatever it is, chase you away from your life." But she was already gone, mentally if not physically. 2 days later, her apartment was empty. Jake never heard from Amy again. He tried calling her new number in Los Angeles, but it was always disconnected. He tried reaching out through mutual friends, but no one had heard from her. 6 months later, Jake was reviewing missing persons reports when he found Amy's name on the list. She had disappeared from her Los Angeles apartment. No signs of struggle, no indication of where she might have gone. But Jake knew. He knew because that very night, as he drove past the old subway entrance, he could hear a new voice calling from below the streets. Amy's voice, calling his name. Jake Morrison, come back to us." And he realized that whatever was down in those tunnels, it wasn't confined to New York City anymore. It could reach people, call to them, draw them back from thousands of miles away. The subway entrance remains sealed to this day. The city has reinforced it twice since Jake and Amy's encounter, adding more welding, more barriers, more warning signs. But sealing something in and keeping it contained are two very different things. And late at night, when the city is quiet, you can still hear them calling from the abandoned subway tunnel beneath Manhattan. More voices now, 17 missing persons, plus Amy Chun, plus others that the reports don't mention. All of them calling for someone, anyone, to join them in the dark. And if you listen very carefully, if you stand outside that entrance on a quiet night, you might hear them calling your name too. Because whatever lives in those tunnels, it's always looking for new voices to add to its collection. The 13th precinct of Lower Manhattan had always been a place where shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. Built in 1892, the red brick building had witnessed more than its share of human darkness, but nothing could have prepared the night shift officers for what they were about to encounter. Detective James Morrison had been working the graveyard shift for 15 years. He thought he had seen everything until that cold October night when the voices started. The The precinct was unusually quiet that evening. Only 4 officers remained on duty after midnight, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors like whispers from another time. Officer Patricia Cole was reviewing case files at her desk when she first noticed it, a faint murmuring sound that seemed to drift through the building's old ventilation system. At first, she dismissed it as perhaps someone's radio left on in another room, or maybe conversation from the street, filtering through the windows. But as the hours passed, the sound became more distinct, more troubling. "Morrison, you hear that?" Patricia whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. The two had been partners for 3 years, and Patricia had never been one to jump at shadows. She was known throughout the precinct for her steady nerves and practical approach to police work. The sound was barely audible at first, like distant conversation seeping through the walls. But there was something wrong with it, something that made the hair on the back of Morrison's neck stand up. The voices seemed to overlap and intertwine in ways that human conversation shouldn't. There were pauses in wrong places, inflections that didn't match the rhythm of normal speech. "Hear what, Cole?" Morrison asked, though he could feel his pulse quickening. He had learned to trust Patricia's instincts over the years. If she was concerned about something, there was usually a good reason for it. "It's coming from downstairs," Patricia said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "From the old interrogation room. Room B7. Morrison felt his blood run cold. Room B7 had been sealed for 32 years, ever since the incident with Thomas Blackwood. The very mention of that room brought back memories that the older officers in the precinct preferred to forget. The story was precinct legend, passed down from one generation of officers to the next like cautionary tale. In 1991, Blackwood, a suspected serial killer who had terrorized the Lower East Side for months, had been brought in for questioning. 3 witnesses saw him enter room B7 with Detective Frank Russo, a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience. But when other officers came to check on them 4 hours later, they found Russo unconscious on the floor and Blackwood dead beside him. His neck was broken, twisted at an impossible angle. Russo claimed he remembered nothing about what had happened during those 4 hours. The official report stated that Blackwood had somehow fallen and broken his own neck during a struggle, but everyone who saw the scene knew that explanation didn't make sense. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds on either man. Just Russo, unconscious but unharmed, and Blackwood with his neck twisted in a way that suggested tremendous force supplied with surgical precision. The room had been locked and sealed ever since. Captain Williams kept the only set of keys in his personal safe, and strict orders had been given that no one was to enter that room under any circumstances. "Patricia, that room has been locked for 3 decades, Morrison said, his voice barely steady. "Nobody has the keys except the captain, and he's been home for hours. Besides, even if someone did get in there, why would they just sit and talk?" But the voices were getting louder now, not shouting, but clearer, like someone had turned up the volume on a distant radio. The conversation seemed to flow and ebb like waves, sometimes becoming almost clear enough to understand before fading back into an incomprehensible murmur. Officer David Chun looked up from his paperwork at the front desk. Chun was a rookie, only 6 months on the force, but he had quickly earned respect for his attention to detail and his ability to stay calm under pressure. "Hey, Morrison, who's down in the basement? I keep hearing people talking down there. Sounds like they're having some kind of meeting or something." Morrison and Patricia exchanged a look that said everything. Chun was hearing it too, and he had no knowledge of the room's history. His observation was completely independent, which made it all the more unsettling. "Chun, come with us," Morrison ordered, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when things were serious. "Rodriguez." He called to the 4th officer, Maria Rodriguez, who was monitoring the radio and dispatch communications. "You too. Nobody stays up here alone tonight." Rodriguez looked up from her station, immediately sensing the tension in Morrison's voice. She had been with the precinct for 8 years and had learned to read the subtle signs that something was wrong. The fact that Morrison wanted everyone together was enough to put her on high alert. The 4 officers made their way to the basement stairs. The old wooden steps creaked under their weight, each sound seeming to echo longer than it should in the narrow stairwell. As they descended, the voices became more distinct. They could make out what seemed to be multiple conversations happening simultaneously, but the words were wrong somehow, like they were speaking backwards or in a language that almost sounded like English, but wasn't quite right. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered as they reached the basement corridor. "It sounds like a whole room full of people down there, like some kind of conference or something." The basement of the 13th precinct was a maze of storage rooms, old evidence lockers, and forgotten offices that hadn't been used in decades. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently along the ceiling, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. The air was stale and heavy, carrying the weight of decades of stored paperwork, old uniforms, and forgotten case files. At the far end of the main hallway stood the door to room B7. It was painted institutional green, a color that had probably been chosen decades ago to be calming, but now looked sickly under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Multiple layers of police tape and official seals covered the frame, creating a barrier that looked almost ritualistic in its thoroughness. The voices were definitely coming from behind that door. There was no question about it now. The sound was too clear, too focused to be coming from anywhere else. Morrison approached slowly, his flashlight beam dancing across the sealed entrance. Every step seemed to take tremendous effort, as if the air itself was becoming thicker as he got closer to the door. The tape was intact. The locks hadn't been touched. The seals showed no signs of tampering. But from the other side of that door came the unmistakable sound of human conversation. "This is impossible," Chen whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmuring from beyond the door. "That room has been sealed since before I was born. How could anyone be in there?" Patricia pressed her ear against the door, her expression growing more troubled with each passing second. The voices were clearer here, close to the source. She could make out individual words now, fragments of sentences that seemed to overlap and contradict each other. "I can hear at least 6 different voices, maybe more. They're talking about cases, old cases, and..." She pulled back from the door, her face pale. "They're talking about us." "What do you mean?" Morrison asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "They know we're here, Jim. They're talking about the 4 officers standing outside the door. They know our names. They know our badge numbers. They know things about us that they shouldn't know." Rodriguez's radio suddenly crackled to life, the static seeming louder than usual in the confined space of the basement corridor. "Unit 13-7, this is dispatch. We're showing unusual activity at your location. Some kind of electronic interference. Is everything all right?" Morrison grabbed the radio, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. "Dispatch, this is Morrison. We're investigating some unusual sounds in the basement. Everything is under control at this time." "Copy that, 13-7. Just be careful down there. We've been getting some strange readings on our monitoring equipment for the past hour. Electronic disturbances, temperature fluctuations, that sort of thing." As soon as Morrison released the radio button, the voices from room B7 suddenly stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the talking had been. It was too complete, too sudden, like someone had thrown a switch and cut off all sound at once. "Did they just respond to the radio?" Chen asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Did they hear what dispatch said?" Before anyone could answer, they heard new sounds from the room. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor inside the sealed space. The footsteps seemed to be circling the room, as if whoever was inside was pacing, thinking, planning. "Everyone back up," Morrison ordered. "Now, get away from the door." But as they stepped away from the entrance to room B7, they heard something that made their blood freeze. A voice, clear as day, coming from the other side of the sealed door. A voice that cut through the silence like a knife. "Detective Morrison, we've been waiting for you." It was a voice Morrison recognized. A voice he had heard before, years ago, during his rookie training and early years on the force. It was Detective Frank Russo, the man who had been found unconscious in this very room 32 years ago. The man who had died of a heart attack in 2018, 7 years after his retirement. Frank, Morrison whispered, unable to stop himself from responding. The name escaped his lips before he could think about the implications of what he was hearing. You remember me, Jimmy? Good. I need to tell you something. Something about what really happened in this room. About Thomas Blackwood and why they sealed us in here together. Patricia grabbed Morrison's arm, her grip tight enough to leave marks. Jim, don't talk to it. Whatever this is, whatever's happening here, it's not Frank. Frank is dead. We went to his funeral. But Morrison was transfixed. The voice was so familiar, so perfectly Frank Russo, that it was impossible to believe it wasn't really him. The slight Brooklyn accent, the way he always called Morrison Jimmy instead of James, the paternalistic tone he used when he was about to share some piece of hard-won wisdom. Frank, what happened that night? What really happened in that room? The voice that answered wasn't Frank's anymore. It was deeper, colder, filled with something that sounded like centuries of accumulated rage and hatred. When it spoke, the temperature in the basement corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. What happened, Detective? Is that some doors should never be opened, some questions should never be asked, and some prisoners should never be left alone with their interrogators. Their breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Jim pulled out his phone to check the temperature, but the screen was blank. None of their electronic devices were working properly anymore. Thomas Blackwood didn't break his own neck, Morrison. Detective Russo didn't have a heart attack 7 years later. And this room has been collecting us ever since. Every officer who's ever worked a case that brought them too close to the darkness. Every detective who's ever stared too long into the abyss. Rodriguez's radio crackled again, the static now so intense it was almost painful to listen to. Unit 13-7, we're showing a significant temperature drop at your location. We're also getting reports of power fluctuations throughout the building. Are you experiencing any equipment malfunctions? But before Morrison could respond, they heard something that made them all run for the stairs without looking back. The sound of multiple locks clicking open from inside room B7. Not one lock, not two, but what sounded like dozens of different mechanisms, all disengaging at once. The seals, Patricia shouted as they ran. The seals are breaking. Behind them, they could hear the ancient door creaking open on hinges that hadn't moved in 3 decades. And from that opening door came the sound of footsteps. Not one set, but many. Dozens of feet moving across the floor, following them toward the stairs. The sounds weren't quite right. The footsteps didn't have the proper rhythm of human walking. Some were too fast, some were too slow. Some seemed to drag across the floor as if the walker was injured or impaired. But they were all moving in the same direction, all following the 4 living officers as they fled toward the upper floors. They burst into the main floor of the precinct, slamming the basement door behind them and turning every lock they could find. Morrison grabbed a chair and wedged it under the door handle, though he doubted it would do much good against whatever was down there. Call for backup. Morrison shouted to Rodriguez. Call everyone, and get Captain Williams down here right now. But as Rodriguez reached for a radio, every light in the precinct went out. The sudden darkness was complete and disorienting. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made their faces look like masks. And from the basement door came a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The sound of dozens of voices, all talking at once, all asking the same question over and over in a rhythm that was hypnotic and terrifying. Why did you open the door? Why did you open the door? Why did you open the door? The voices seemed to be getting closer, as if they were moving up through the building itself, through the walls and the floors and the very structure of the precinct. Captain Williams arrived 20 minutes later with the full tactical team. They found the 4 officers huddled in the front lobby, refusing to go anywhere near the basement door. Morrison was on his radio, trying to coordinate with other precincts. Patricia was checking and rechecking her service weapon. Chen was sitting in a corner, staring at nothing. Rodriguez was clutching a crucifix that she had pulled from somewhere and was whispering prayers in Spanish. Morrison, what the hell happened here? Williams demanded as he surveyed the scene. The emergency lighting was still on, giving everything a hellish red tint. Several of the windows had cracked for no apparent reason, and there was a smell in the air like ozone and burnt metal. Captain, we need to evacuate this building. Tonight. And we need to call someone who knows about unusual situations. Someone who specializes in things that can't be explained through normal police procedures. Williams looked at his veteran detective like he'd lost his mind. Morrison was one of the most level-headed officers he'd ever worked with. The fact that he was suggesting they call in paranormal investigators to a police precinct was deeply troubling. Unusual situations? Morrison, you're talking about calling ghost hunters to a police precinct. Do you have any idea how that would look? What that would do to our credibility? Sir, room B7 is open. Williams went pale. Those 4 words carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have. He had been captain for 12 years, and the sealed room had been a constant presence in his consciousness. A reminder of things that couldn't be explained or understood through normal channels. That's impossible. I have the only keys, and they're locked in my safe. I checked them just last week. He stopped mid-sentence, reaching for his key ring. His hand shook as he went through each key, checking and rechecking. The keys to room B7 were gone. Not missing, not misplaced. Gone, as if they had never existed at all. Captain, Patricia said quietly, her voice steady, but her eyes showing the strain of what they had experienced. We need to get out of here. All of us. Right now. This building isn't safe anymore. That's when they heard it. Coming from the basement, through the locked door, up through the building's ventilation system. The voice of Detective Frank Russo, as clear as if he were standing right beside them. Captain Williams, we've been waiting for you too. We have so much to tell you. So many cases to discuss. So many questions that need answers. Williams felt his legs go weak. Frank Russo had been his mentor when he first joined the force. He had been the one to recommend Williams for promotion to detective. He had been at Williams' wedding. He had been like a father to him. Frank, Williams whispered, just as Morrison had done. Hello, Captain. It's good to hear your voice again. Why don't you come downstairs? We have so much catching up to do. The tactical team that Williams had brought with him was getting restless. They had been called in for an emergency situation, but all they found were 4 shaken officers and a lot of talk about supernatural phenomena. Their training didn't cover this kind of situation. Sir, Sergeant Thompson, the tactical team leader, said quietly, What are your orders? Do you want us to secure the basement? Williams looked at his officers, at the fear in their eyes, at the way they all stayed as far from the basement door as possible. He looked at the emergency lighting, at the cracked windows, at the electronic equipment that wasn't working properly. No, he said finally. We evacuate the building. Everyone out. Now. Sir, with respect, we can't evacuate a police precinct because of strange noises. What's the official reason? Before Williams could answer, they heard Frank Russo's voice again. But this time, it wasn't alone. Other voices had joined it. Voices that some of the older officers recognized. Detectives who had died years ago. Officers who had worked difficult cases and had never quite recovered from what they had seen. Don't leave us here alone again, Captain. We've been waiting so long for someone to listen. So long for someone to understand what really happened in that room. The voices were getting louder, and they were no longer confined to the basement. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, from the very structure of the building. Gas leak, Williams said quickly. The official reason is a suspected gas leak. Everyone out. Seal the building. Nobody comes back until we figure out what's really going on here. The 13th precinct was evacuated that night. The tactical team secured the perimeter while the 4 officers who had been on duty gave their statements. Officially, it was due to a gas leak and potential structural damage, but the 4 officers who had been on duty knew the truth. Room B7 wasn't just sealed to keep people out. It had been sealed to keep something in. And now that something was loose in the building, collecting voices, gathering the essence of everyone who had ever worked those dark cases in that cursed room, Morrison transferred to a different precinct the next week. He put in for a transfer to the fraud division, as far from violent crime as he could get. Patricia took early retirement and moved to a small town upstate, where she opened a bookstore. Chun requested a transfer to traffic enforcement and never worked another night shift. Rodriguez started carrying a crucifix and refused to work in any building that was more than 20 years old. But sometimes, late at night, when they're lying in bed trying to sleep, they still hear those voices, whispering their names, asking why they opened the door, asking why they left them alone in that room. The 13th precinct remains closed to this day. The official reason is budget cuts and structural concerns. The building sits empty, its windows boarded up, its doors chained shut. But if you walk past the building on a quiet night, especially in October when the air is crisp and the shadows are long, you might hear them too, the voices behind the precinct walls, still talking, still waiting, still collecting the stories of everyone who ever tried to serve justice in a world where justice sometimes comes at a price that's too high to pay. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you might hear a new voice among the others, the voice of Captain Williams, who went back to the building one night, 3 months later, to retrieve some personal items from his office. He was never seen again, but his voice joined the chorus in room B7, still asking questions, still looking for answers that might never come. The building is scheduled for demolition next year, but the construction crews who have been hired keep finding excuses to delay the work. They claim they hear voices from inside the building, voices asking them not to tear down the walls, voices asking them to leave the room intact. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. This story is based on the reported experiences of 4 NYPD officers at Manhattan's 13th Precinct in October 2023. The building remains officially closed pending structural renovation. The rain hammered against the patrol car windows like skeletal fingers, tapping for entry. Officer Daniel Morrison adjusted his radio with trembling hands, the static crackling through the humid Brooklyn night air. His partner, Officer Jessica Chun, gripped the steering wheel tighter as they approached the towering apartment complex at 1247 Riverside Drive. Dispatch, this is Unit 17 responding to the 4th call from apartment 4B tonight. Daniel spoke into his radio, his voice barely steady. What's the nature of the complaint again? The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the interference. Domestic disturbance, possible intruder, reports of unusual activity. Multiple 911 calls from same number. Jessica parked the car beneath the flickering streetlight that cast eerie shadows across the building's weathered brick facade. The apartment complex loomed above them like a sleeping giant, its windows dark except for the occasional blue glow of television screens behind thin curtains. 4th time tonight, Jessica muttered, checking her service weapon. Same apartment, same caller. Mrs. Dorothy Williams, 73 years old, lives alone according to the records. Daniel nodded, but something felt wrong. Something had felt wrong since their first call to this address 6 hours ago. Each time they had climbed those stairs, knocked on that door, found nothing. Each time Mrs. Williams had sounded more desperate on the phone, describing intruders that left no trace, sounds that had no source. The first call had come in at 11:47 p.m. Daniel remembered checking his watch as they pulled up to the building for the first time that night. Mrs. Williams had reported sounds in her walls, voices whispering her name, shadows moving through her apartment when no one was there. When they had knocked, no one answered. The superintendent had let them in with his master key, and they had found the apartment completely empty, with no signs of disturbance. The second call came at 1:23 a.m. This time, Mrs. Williams had been hysterical, claiming someone was in her bedroom, going through her belongings. She had described the intruder in vivid detail, tall, wearing dark clothing, moving silently through her home. Again, they had found nothing. The bedroom was pristine, undisturbed, as if no one had been inside for hours. The third call at 3:45 a.m. had been the most disturbing. Mrs. Williams had whispered into the phone, afraid to speak loudly. She claimed the intruder was standing right outside her bedroom door, that she could see his shadow beneath the gap. She had described hearing breathing, slow and deliberate, like someone savoring the fear they were creating. When Daniel and Jessica arrived, the apartment was not only empty, but felt cold, as if the heat had been turned off for days. Now, at 4:17 a.m., they were responding to the fourth call of the night. The lobby door hung slightly ajar, its automatic lock mechanism broken for months, according to the super. Their footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway as they made their way to the elevator. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting intermittent shadows that seemed to move independently of their bodies. "You know what bothers me about these calls," Daniel said as they waited for the elevator. "Each time we get here, she describes exactly what we're doing, before we do it." Jessica frowned. "What do you mean?" "The second call tonight. She said the tall officer is checking his gun. The Asian woman is looking at her watch." We hadn't even gotten out of the car yet, and during the third call, she told dispatch that I was wearing my father's old watch, the one with the scratched crystal. How could she possibly know that? The elevator doors opened with a metallic groan. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected their images infinitely, creating a corridor of police officers stretching into eternity. Daniel pressed the button for the fourth floor, and the elevator lurched upward with mechanical protests. "Probably just anxiety," Jessica rationalized, but her voice lacked conviction. "Old people, they get paranoid, especially living alone in neighborhoods like this. Maybe she's been watching us from her window." "Jessica, her apartment faces the courtyard. She can't see the street from there." The elevator climbed slowly, the floors ticking by with agonizing slowness. Between the second and third floors, the elevator shuddered to a stop. The lights flickered, and for a moment, they were plunged into complete darkness. "Great," Jessica muttered, pressing the emergency button. Nothing happened. She pressed it again, harder this time. In the darkness, Daniel's radio crackled to life. "Unit 17. We have the caller on the line again. She says you're stuck between floors, and that the tall officer's trying not to panic." Daniel felt his heart rate spike. He was indeed fighting off a wave of claustrophobia, something he had struggled with since childhood, but had never told anyone, not even Jessica. The elevator lurched back to life, and they continued their ascent. When the doors opened on the fourth floor, both officers were relieved to step into the hallway, even though the corridor stretching before them looked more ominous than ever. The hallway on the fourth floor stretched before them, a tunnel of peeling wallpaper and worn carpeting. Apartment 4B sat at the far end, its door painted a faded blue that looked almost black in the dim lighting. As they approached, Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. The door was slightly open, but that wasn't what frightened him. What frightened him was that he could see light coming from inside the apartment. Warm yellow light, like candlelight or an old lamp. During their previous visits, the apartment had been dark, and Mrs. Williams had never answered their knocks. "Mrs. Williams?" Jessica called out, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon. "This is the NYPD. You called about an intruder." From inside the apartment came a voice, faint but clearly audible. "Please come in, officers. I've been waiting for you." Daniel and Jessica exchanged glances. The voice sounded elderly, female, but there was something about it that seemed off. It was too clear, too calm for someone who had been reporting intruders and disturbances all night. Daniel pushed the door open slowly, his flashlight beam cutting through the warm glow that emanated from the living room. The apartment was small, furnished with outdated but well-maintained furniture. A floral couch faced an old television, but instead of being blank as it had been during their previous visits, the screen now displayed a black and white movie with the sound turned down. "Mrs. Williams?" Jessica called again, stepping into the living room. "Are you here?" The apartment felt different this time. Lived in. Comfortable. There were fresh flowers in a vase on the coffee table, roses and baby's breath that filled the air with a sweet fragrance. A cup of tea sat steaming on the kitchen counter, as if someone had just finished preparing it. "In here, dears," came the voice from the bedroom. "I'm afraid I can't get up. My arthritis is particularly bad tonight." They moved toward the bedroom, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting that Daniel could have sworn hadn't been there during their earlier visits. The hallway was lined with framed photographs, family pictures, wedding photos, images of children and grandchildren. One photo in particular caught Daniel's attention. A young couple standing in front of this very building, probably taken in the 1950s based on their clothing. The bedroom door was open, and inside they could see a figure in the bed. An elderly woman with silver hair sat propped up against pillows, wearing a floral nightgown. She smiled at them warmly as they entered. "Mrs. Williams?" Jessica asked, approaching the bed cautiously. "Oh yes, dear. Thank you so much for coming. I know you've had quite a night running back and forth. I'm so sorry for all the trouble." Daniel studied the woman carefully. She appeared to be in her 70s, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. But something about her seemed insubstantial, as if she were slightly out of focus. "Ma'am, we've responded to several calls from this apartment tonight, but each time we arrived, no one was here. Can you explain what's been happening?" Mrs. Williams smiled sadly. "I'm afraid that's rather complicated, Officer Morrison." Daniel felt his stomach drop. He hadn't introduced himself. His name wasn't on his uniform. How did she know his name? "How do you know my name, ma'am?" "Your grandmother told me about you, dear. Catherine Morrison. She was so proud of you when you joined the police force. She said you had always wanted to help people, just like your father." The room seemed to spin around Daniel. His grandmother, Catherine, had died 3 years ago, and his father, also a police officer, had been killed in the line of duty when Daniel was 12 years old. Very few people knew these details about his family history. "Ma'am, I think there's been some confusion. My grandmother passed away 3 years ago." "Did she, dear?" Mrs. Williams tilted her head, her smile never wavering. "Time works so differently when you're my age. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that she was visiting me, telling me about her grandson, the police officer." Jessica stepped closer to the bed. "Mrs. Williams, are you feeling all right? Have you been taking any medication that might cause confusion?" "Oh, I'm not confused, dear. I'm quite clear about what's happening. You see, Catherine and I have been having the most wonderful conversations. She's been keeping me company since the incident." "What incident?" Daniel asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer. Mrs. Williams gestured to the nightstand beside her bed. "The phone, dear. I was trying to reach it when my heart gave out. I had been having chest pains all day, but I didn't want to bother anyone. When it got really bad, I tried to call for help, but I couldn't quite reach the phone from where I fell." Daniel looked at the nightstand. The telephone sat just slightly out of reach of where Mrs. Williams lay in the bed. If someone had collapsed beside the bed, they might be able to see the phone, but not reach it. "When did this happen, Mrs. Williams?" "Oh, it was a Tuesday. I remember because my stories were on television. That was, let me think. Yes, that was 6 months ago. February 14th. Valentine's Day. Isn't it ironic? The day dedicated to love. And there I was, dying all alone." Jessica's radio crackled to life. "Unit 17, Building Management is requesting an update on the situation. They're also asking about the welfare check that was requested for apartment 4B 6 months ago. The tenant, Dorothy Williams, was reported missing by her family." Daniel felt the pieces clicking into place, but his mind refused to accept what they were telling him. "Mrs. Williams, if this happened 6 months ago, how are we talking to you now?" "Oh, that's Catherine's doing. Your grandmother has been such a dear. When I realized what had happened to me, I was so frightened. I didn't understand why no one could see me, why no one answered when I called for help. But Catherine explained everything. She said that sometimes, when someone dies alone and afraid, they get stuck between where they were and where they're supposed to go." The bedroom suddenly felt much colder. Daniel could see his breath forming small clouds in the air. And the phone calls tonight. Catherine has been helping me practice. She said that if I concentrated hard enough, if I really focused on reaching out, I might be able to make the phone work. It took months to learn how, but tonight I finally managed it. Jessica moved to the window and looked out into the courtyard. Mrs. Williams, your family has been looking for you. They reported you missing 6 months ago. I know, dear. I've seen them. My daughter Margaret came by several times, knocking on the door, calling my name, but I couldn't answer then. I didn't know how. It wasn't until Catherine taught me about focusing my energy that I could interact with the world again. Daniel's radio crackled again. Unit 17, dispatch has been reviewing the call logs from tonight. The voice analysis is unusual. The caller's voice patterns match those of Dorothy Williams from calls she made to various services over the past 2 years. But there's something else. There's a second voice in the background of tonight's calls. Very faint, but it's there. An elderly female voice, possibly providing coaching or guidance. That would be Catherine, Mrs. Williams said with a fond smile. She's been teaching me how to make contact, how to reach through the barrier between life and death. She said it was important that I learn, because my family needs to know what happened to me. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair beside the bed. Mrs. Williams, are you telling me that you and my grandmother are that you're both dead? Oh yes, dear. I'm afraid so. But death isn't quite what people think it is. It's not an ending so much as a transition. Some people move on right away, but others get stuck, usually because of unfinished business or strong emotional attachments. What's your unfinished business? Mrs. Williams looked sad. I died alone, and my family never knew what happened to me. They've been torturing themselves with questions. Was I kidnapped? Did I wander off and get lost? Was I suffering? The not knowing has been destroying them, especially my daughter Margaret. Catherine showed me how Margaret cries herself to sleep every night, wondering if her mother is still alive somewhere, in pain and calling for help. Jessica had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. What about Catherine? What's her unfinished business? Mrs. Williams smiled warmly. Oh, Catherine's business was finished long ago. She made peace with her death, said goodbye to her loved ones in her own way. But she chose to stay behind to help others who weren't so fortunate. She calls herself a guide for the lost souls. Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes. Is she here now? Oh yes, dear. She's standing right behind you. She's been so proud watching you work tonight, seeing how much you care about helping people. She wanted me to tell you that your father would be proud too. Daniel turned around, but saw nothing except the empty bedroom doorway. However, he could swear he caught the faint scent of his grandmother's perfume, a light lavender fragrance that she had worn for as long as he could remember. Can I talk to her? Mrs. Williams closed her eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When she opened them again, her voice had changed slightly. It was still her voice, but with a different inflection, a different cadence that Daniel recognized immediately. Hello, sweetheart. Daniel's composure cracked. Grandma Catherine, is it really you? It's me, Danny, my beautiful grandson, all grown up and helping people just like you always said you would. I miss you so much. There's so much I wanted to tell you. So much that's happened since. I know, sweetheart. I've been watching. I'm so proud of the man you've become, and I'm proud of how you've handled tonight. It takes courage to face the unknown, to accept that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. Jessica watched this exchange with a mixture of awe and skepticism. Catherine, if you're really there, can you tell me something only Daniel's grandmother would know? The voice that came through Mrs. Williams chuckled softly. You're a skeptical one, aren't you, Jessica? That's good. Daniel needs someone who will keep him grounded. Let's see. You're wearing the bracelet Daniel gave you for your birthday last year. It has a small charm shaped like a police badge. But what Daniel doesn't know is that you also carry his father's badge number written on a piece of paper in your wallet. You found out what it was and wrote it down because you wanted to feel connected to his family history. Jessica's eyes widened. She did indeed carry that piece of paper, and she had never told Daniel about it. It was a private gesture, a way of honoring the father he had lost. How could you possibly know that? Death doesn't end love, dear. It just changes how we express it. I've been watching over Daniel, but that means I've also been watching the people who are important to him. You make him happy, Jessica. You make him feel like he has a family again. Daniel was crying openly now. Grandma, I have so many questions. About death, about what comes next, about... I know, sweetheart, but tonight isn't about me. Tonight is about Dorothy. She needs your help to finish her business so she can move on, and her family needs closure. The voice changed back to Mrs. Williams' normal tone. Catherine is right. I've been trapped here for 6 months because I couldn't let my family know what happened to me. But now that you found me, now that you can tell them the truth, I think I'm ready to go. Daniel wiped his eyes and tried to regain his professional composure. Mrs. Williams, where's your physical body? In the bedroom closet, dear, behind the winter coats. I collapsed there when I was trying to reach the phone, and I never got up. Jessica moved to the closet and opened the door. Behind a row of heavy coats, she found what remained of Dorothy Williams. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but it was clear that she had died of natural causes, probably the heart attack she had described. Dispatch, this is Unit 17. Jessica spoke into her radio. We need the coroner, the medical examiner, and a supervisor at 1247, Riverside Drive, apartment 4B. We have a natural death, elderly female, appears to have been deceased for approximately 6 months. As Jessica coordinated with dispatch, Daniel turned back to Mrs. Williams, who was still sitting up in bed, smiling peacefully. What happens to you now? Now I can rest, dear. Catherine has been explaining to me about the other side. It sounds wonderful. No more pain, no more loneliness, and I'll be able to see my husband again. He passed 5 years ago, and I've missed him terribly. Will we see you again? I mean, will your spirit? No, dear. Once I cross over, I'll be at peace. I won't need to linger in this world anymore. But Catherine might visit you from time to time. She's chosen a different path. Daniel looked around the room, hoping to catch another glimpse of his grandmother, but saw nothing. However, he felt a presence, warm and comforting, like being wrapped in a familiar blanket. Mrs. Williams closed her eyes and leaned back against the pillows. Thank you both for helping me tonight. Thank you for listening, for believing, for giving me the chance to finish what I needed to finish. As she spoke, her image began to fade slightly, becoming more transparent. Tell my daughter Margaret that I wasn't afraid at the end. Tell her that I thought of her and her children, and that I died knowing I was loved. Tell her to stop blaming herself for not checking on me sooner. There was nothing she could have done. Well, tell her, Jessica said softly. Mrs. Williams smiled one last time, then simply wasn't there anymore. The bed was empty, the pillows undisturbed. The warm light that had filled the apartment faded, leaving only the harsh glare of their flashlights. But the scent of lavender perfume remained. Over the next several hours, Daniel and Jessica dealt with the practical aspects of their discovery. The coroner confirmed that Dorothy Williams had died of a massive heart attack approximately 6 months earlier. The building superintendent explained that the apartment had been checked only superficially when she was reported missing. A quick knock on the door and a glance through the windows. No one had thought to search the closet. Margaret Williams, Dorothy's daughter, arrived at the scene just as the sun was rising. She was a woman in her 50s, with her mother's kind eyes and gentle manner. When Daniel and Jessica explained what they had found, she broke down crying. But there was relief mixed with the grief. I knew something had happened to her, Margaret said through her tears. Mom would never just disappear without telling someone. But everyone kept saying maybe she had dementia. Maybe she wandered off. I knew that wasn't true. She was sharp as a tack right up to the end. Daniel took Margaret aside and spoke to her privately. Your mother wanted me to tell you something specific. She said she wasn't afraid at the end, that she thought of you and your children, and that she died knowing she was loved. She also said to stop blaming yourself for not checking on her sooner. There was nothing you could have done. Margaret stared at him with wide eyes. How could you possibly know that I've been blaming myself? I haven't told anyone, but it's been eating me alive. I kept thinking if I had just called her that day, if I had just stopped by. Sometimes the dead find ways to communicate things that the living need to hear, Daniel said gently. Your mother is at peace now. She's not suffering, and she's not alone. As the investigation wrapped up and Dorothy Williams' body was removed from the apartment, Daniel and Jessica prepared to leave. The apartment felt different now, empty in a way that was peaceful rather than disturbing. Walking back to their patrol car, Jessica asked the question that had been troubling her. Daniel, do you really believe all that happened back there? The conversation with your grandmother, Mrs. Williams' spirit, all of it? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. 3 days ago, I would have said no. I would have said there had to be a rational explanation for everything. But tonight I felt something I haven't felt since my grandmother died. I felt like she was really there, watching over me. But how is it possible? How can the dead communicate with the living? I don't know how it's possible, Jessica, but I know what I experienced. And I know that Margaret Williams finally has the closure she needed. Sometimes that's more important than understanding the how or why. They drove through the Brooklyn streets as the sun continued to rise, bringing light to the shadows of the night. The rain had stopped, and the city was beginning to wake up. People were starting their morning routines, heading to work, beginning another day in lives that would soon return to normal. But for Daniel and Jessica, normal had shifted. They had experienced something that challenged everything they thought they knew about life and death, about the boundaries between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. As they approached the precinct, Daniel's radio crackled with a message from dispatch. Unit 17, we have a commendation from the Williams family. They wanted to express their gratitude for your sensitivity and professionalism in handling this difficult case. Jessica looked at Daniel. How did they know to call us sensitive? We filed a standard report about finding a natural death. Maybe Margaret told them about our conversation, Daniel replied, but privately. He wondered if there was another explanation. Maybe his grandmother was still looking out for him, making sure he received recognition for doing the right thing. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself thinking often about that night. He researched the building at 1247, Riverside Drive, and discovered that his grandmother had indeed lived there, in the same apartment where they had found Dorothy Williams. Catherine Morrison had moved into apartment 4B in 1952 as a young bride, and had lived there for over 40 years before moving to a nursing home in her final years. He also learned that Dorothy Williams had been Catherine's neighbor for decades. They had been close friends, looking out for each other as they aged. When Catherine moved to the nursing home, Dorothy had been one of the few people who visited her regularly. Maybe that's why Grandma stayed behind to help her, Daniel told Jessica over dinner one evening. Maybe she felt responsible for Dorothy being alone. Or maybe she just couldn't bear the thought of her friend dying scared and isolated, the way she probably feared dying herself. Jessica replied. Daniel nodded. It made sense that Catherine would use whatever abilities she had in death to help her friend find peace. It was consistent with the woman he remembered, someone who had always put others' needs before her own. A month after the incident, Daniel received an unexpected phone call. It was Margaret Williams. Officer Morrison, I hope you don't mind me calling you directly. I got your number from the precinct. I wanted to thank you again for how you handled finding my mother, but I also want to tell you about something that happened. What's that, ma'am? I was cleaning out Mom's apartment, going through her things, and I found a letter. It was addressed to me, in her handwriting, but it was dated the day she died. She wrote about having chest pains and being scared, but she also wrote about a friend who had promised to watch over her. Someone named Catherine. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. What exactly did the letter say about Catherine? She wrote that Catherine had visited her in a dream and told her not to be afraid of dying, that death was just another doorway. Catherine promised that if Mom got lost or scared, she would help guide her to where she needed to go. The letter said Catherine had died a few years earlier, but had chosen to stay close to help people who were having trouble passing on. That's remarkable. Officer Morrison, the strange thing is that my mother wrote this letter with her left hand. She was right-handed her whole life, but she had arthritis in her right hand that made writing painful. She only used her left hand for writing when her right hand was completely unusable. And according to the coroner, she died of a sudden, massive heart attack. She wouldn't have had time to write a letter. Daniel didn't know what to say. The implications of what Margaret was telling him were staggering. There's something else, Margaret continued. At the bottom of the letter, there's a message that doesn't sound like my mother's voice at all. It says, "Tell my grandson Danny that I'm proud of him and that his father is watching over him too. Love, Catherine M." Daniel had to sit down. No one except his grandmother had ever called him Danny, and the M clearly stood for Morrison. "Mrs. Williams, would it be possible for me to see that letter?" "Of course. I was hoping you'd ask. I think it was meant for you as much as it was for me." When Daniel saw the letter, he immediately recognized his grandmother's handwriting in that final paragraph. It was distinctive, with the flowing cursive she had learned in school in the 1940s. The rest of the letter was clearly Dorothy Williams' handwriting, but that last paragraph was unmistakably his grandmother's. Jessica examined the letter as well and agreed that there were two distinct handwriting styles present. "It's as if your grandmother guided Mrs. Williams' hand to write her own message," she said. "Is that possible?" A month ago, I would have said no. Now I'm not so sure what's possible. The letter became a source of great comfort to Daniel. He kept a photocopy of it in his wallet, and whenever he had a particularly difficult day, he would read his grandmother's final message to him. It reminded him that he was part of something larger than himself, that love could transcend even death. 6 months after the incident at 1247 Riverside Drive, Daniel received another surprise. He was working a late shift, patrolling the same Brooklyn neighborhoods, when his radio crackled with a familiar pattern of static, followed by a very faint voice. "Danny, this is the last time I'll be able to reach you like this." He pulled his patrol car over to the side of the road and grabbed his radio. "Grandma Catherine." "Yes, sweetheart. I wanted to say goodbye properly this time. I've stayed as long as I could, but it's time for me to move on. Dorothy has been safely guided to where she needs to be, and you're strong enough now to face the future without me watching over your shoulder. I don't want you to go. I'm not ready. You've been ready for a long time, Danny. You're a good man, a good police officer, and you're going to have a wonderful life. Jessica is going to say yes, by the way." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had been planning to propose to Jessica for weeks, but hadn't told anyone, not even his closest friends. "How did you?" The dead know things about the future sometimes, just like we know things about the past. She loves you, Danny. She's going to make you very happy, and you're going to make her happy too. Your father and I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become. Will I ever see you again? Not in this life, sweetheart, but someday, when your own time comes, and that's many, many years from now, I'll be there to welcome you home. Until then, live your life fully. Help people. Love deeply. And remember that you're never truly alone." The radio went silent except for the normal static of the police frequency. Daniel sat in his car for a long time, crying quietly, saying his own private goodbye to the grandmother who had shaped so much of who he had become. True to Catherine's prediction, Jessica said yes when Daniel proposed to her 3 weeks later. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony attended by friends from the police department and Jessica's family. During the ceremony, both Daniel and Jessica caught the faint scent of lavender perfume, though no one else seemed to notice it. Daniel kept the story of apartment 4B mostly to himself, sharing the full details only with Jessica and, eventually, with Margaret Williams, who became a close friend over the years. But the experience changed how he approached his work as a police officer. He became known in his precinct for his sensitivity in dealing with families of missing persons and unexplained deaths. He had a reputation for going the extra mile, for listening carefully to details that other officers might dismiss, for treating every case as if it involved someone he cared about personally. Other officers sometimes asked him about his methods, about how he seemed to know exactly what to say to grieving families, or how he could remain so calm in disturbing situations. Daniel would just say that he had learned to listen not just to what people were saying, but to what they needed to hear. The apartment building at 1247 Riverside Drive still stands, though it has changed ownership several times since that night. Apartment 4B was renovated and re-rented, and the new tenants report nothing unusual. The apartment feels peaceful now, according to those who have lived there, warm and welcoming, like a place where people were once very happy. Sometimes, when Daniel drives past the building during his patrols, he thinks about that night and the lessons it taught him. He learned that death is not the end of love, that some bonds are strong enough to transcend the barrier between life and whatever comes after. He learned that there are mysteries in the world that can't be explained by logic or science, but that doesn't make them any less real or important. Most importantly, he learned that helping people, whether they're living or dead, is the most meaningful thing he can do with his life. Jessica, now Jessica Morrison, became a detective and specialized in cold cases. She credits that night at apartment 4B with teaching her to pay attention to details that others might overlook, to listen for the stories that the evidence is trying to tell. She has solved several cases that had been dormant for years, reuniting families with answers they thought they would never get. On quiet evenings, when the city settles into the peaceful rhythm of night, Daniel and Jessica sometimes talk about that experience and what it meant to them. They wonder about Catherine and Dorothy, about where they are now and whether they're at peace. They wonder about the other lost souls who might be wandering the world, looking for someone to help them find their way home. And sometimes, when they're working particularly difficult cases involving missing persons or unexplained deaths, they catch a familiar scent on the evening breeze or hear a whisper of guidance in the static of their radios. They've learned to trust these moments, to follow the subtle signs that seem to lead them toward the truth, because they know now that love doesn't end with death, that those who care about us continue to watch over us in ways we may never fully understand. They know that the world is full of mysteries and miracles, and that sometimes the most important job of the living is to help the dead find peace. The story of apartment 4B became a legend of sorts within the Brooklyn Police Department, passed down through generations of officers as a reminder that their job is about more than just enforcing laws and catching criminals. It's about serving people, protecting the vulnerable, and sometimes being the bridge between those who need help and those who are unable to help themselves. And in the end, that's what Catherine Morrison and Dorothy Williams taught Daniel and Jessica that night, that service to others is the highest calling, whether you're alive or dead, and that the bonds of love and compassion can overcome even the greatest mysteries of existence. The apartment no one should patrol became, instead, the apartment that taught two police officers the true meaning of their oath to serve and protect, not just the living, but anyone who needs help finding their way home.